Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 196, December 16th to December 22nd, 1864. Last week, we had the final destruction of the Confederate Army at Nashville. John Bell Hood will be removed as Army commander, and the realistic hopes of turning the tide away from Robert E. Lee's army are going to leave with him. George Thomas will solidify himself as one of the better generals for the Union in the meantime. This week, we will discuss the raid of George Stoneman into Southwest Virginia. Remember, we had been there a while back at Saltville. We are actually going back to the same area this week. First, though, we need to regroup just a little bit and put everything into context. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And of course, we have some new episodes that have been posted here. We have a monument ranking, or my personal favorite battlefield monuments, a top 10 list, some honorable mentions. I included some pictures. We've done some movie reviews. We did Alvarez Kelly not too long ago. We're actually going to go back to a movie review here upcoming in January. I think we need to go through our classics list here, and we will do Gone with the Wind. And that one is going to be depicting some of the events that happened in the Atlanta campaign. So it's about time that we did that now that we're completely through with Atlanta. We've gone through the March to the Sea as well. So we combined those two events. I think it's about time we do the classic Gone with the Wind. So if any movie review sounds interesting to you, we've done memoir reviews and picture slideshows. There's a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. To put everything into context for us, I wanted to mention that this week Savannah will be evacuated. Fort McAllister was taken by storm by William Babcock Hazen's troops, meaning that William T. Sherman can resupply his army from the sea. Now, William J. Hardee might have been a better choice than John Bell Hood as Army commander, but with really only a handful of militia and Joe Wheeler's cavalry to go toe-to-toe with Sherman's combat veterans. Sherman will let this small army leave, getting him some additional criticism. We have talked before about how Sherman's goals sometimes are not really aligned with Grant, and it is a fair piece of criticism. His goal was to tear up the Georgia countryside, which he did a good job of, and then he captured Savannah. That was the secondary goal there. He needs Savannah in order to complete his famous march to the sea, in order to make sure that his army is supplied, and once that happens, it's kind of a job well done. We can draw a very similar parallel to the Atlanta campaign. There is an argument that Sherman could have pursued the Confederate Army, could have pursued John Bell Hood's remnants. Once he is able to evacuate from Atlanta, he might have been able to cut off part of the army, but he just doesn't do that. He waits until Confederates are out of the way. He's able to enter Atlanta. We did our job. We can rest now, right? Now, you could counter the argument, hindsight being 2020, now that we have fought the Battle of Franklin, we've had the Confederate disaster of Nashville. You could counter this argument by saying that, hey, Sherman understands what it takes to win the war, a very similar way that Grant thinks he's going to move his army through Georgia, and by doing so, he's going to remove the will of the Confederacy to keep waging war. Should be pointed out that there were already a lot of desertions from Georgians, from Tennesseans, because of how things have been going in the sub-theater of the war. So wouldn't you think that perhaps, with a state that's sort of already given up, so to speak, in many ways, many people want the war just to end, so you might just be able to trap that secondary field army of the Confederates, really the only major army left besides Robert E. Lee's cooped up forces, and if you eliminate them, you could actually expedite the end of the war. Now, obviously, John Bell Hood does a pretty good job of that at Franklin and at Nashville, But you see my point. Sherman could have probably done a little bit more himself to actually finishing off the Confederate army. But I think the point here is really to highlight how terrible a holiday the Confederacy is having. If we look to the main theater of the war, Robert E. Lee is still bottled up at Richmond and Petersburg. He no longer has the strength to get out and shift battlefields elsewhere. We saw the Valley Campaign of '64 end. That's really the last gasp that the Confederates are going to have, the last hope that they will have to shift the theater away from Petersburg as they had done back in 1862. Remember, 1862, we had some success in stopping George B. McClellan's army, and then Robert E. Lee is able to shift his forces back to the north. That's where we run into Pope. We have Second Manassas, and then off of that success, you're able then to invade Maryland, results in the Battle of Antietam. And really, that fall of 62 is probably the high tide of the Confederacy. Now, you have far less in terms of troops left, so you're not going to be able to wage quite an offensive action. And then you have a very different kind of commander in Ulysses S. Grant, who's really just going to stay where he is. There's really no incentive for Grant to shift back up to Washington. Even with Jubal Early threatening Washington at one point, getting to the outskirts, he's really not as concerned with that. If we shift to the secondary theater, the sub-theater of the war, the West, quote-unquote, we have John Bell Hood, who has essentially wrecked his army. It's no longer going to be a viable threat following Nashville. In fact, you're actually going to see very soon, the army is just going to disintegrate. We're going to have units shifted elsewhere, different theaters. There's going to be some that are shifted to join Johnson, and he's going to try to establish some kind of defense in the Carolinas, as Sherman is going to start to head that way. Savannah has fallen, which is another port city, and very soon there are going to be operations against Wilmington, which is really the last major port that the Confederates are going to have. As we close out 1864, it will be pretty much doom and gloom for Jefferson Davis, but we will get into a deeper recap here in a later episode. We will sojourn from talking about the bigger picture and report on George Stoneman's Southwest Virginia raid. Remember that there had been a previous attempt in this region to get at the key salt works in the vicinity. If you recall, the First Battle of Saltville had ended poorly for the Union troops, there being a massacre of wounded Federals, both Northern aligned Tennessee troops, and men from 2 regiments of United States Colored Cavalry. Many of the same troops would be under the command of George Stoneman, who is going to want to try again. Now, if you recall, Stoneman had tried to launch a grand raid around Georgia during the Atlanta campaign, the goal of that operation potentially being the liberation of Andersonville Prison. This had been quite ambitious and had resulted in a failure, Stoneman becoming the highest-ranking officer to be captured during the war. Well, at the request of William T. Sherman, Stoneman would be exchanged fairly quickly, meaning he's going to be available for this new venture. Stoneman will have Burbage's command, including the 5th and 6th United States Colored Cavalry, Kentucky and Tennessee regiments, to support as well. He would have additional support from Alvin Gillam's command, Gillam being a Tennessee native who had served in this region since Mill Springs. The primary Confederate commander would be John C. Breckinridge. With him would be Basil Duke and the remnants of John Hunt Morgan's command. Richard Morgan, brother to the famous cavalry officer, would be captured during the campaign, as the Northern troops made their way from Tennessee into Virginia. Burbage would make his objective Marion, Breckinridge trying to set up defensively there. Utilizing artillery, Burbage would be blunted in his attacks. December 17th would actually see these initial assaults, and they would be renewed on the second day. There would be some success in pushing the rebels out of their breastworks. However, counterattacks would see those victories short-lived. Basil Duke would collapse the federal flank, putting the Northern troops to flight, both sides suffering around 90 or so killed in the action. Despite this success, Breckinridge would be at a numerical disadvantage, and furthermore would have expended much of his ammunition during the battle. He would have 1,500 men compared to maybe 5,000, and thus the Confederates would withdraw. Indeed, they would need to abandon the salt works as well, allowing for Stoneman to capture and damage both mines. The Battle of Marion is a good example of just how depleted the Confederacy is in manpower. We have these actions that are further afield, from the main theaters of the war anyway, that probably would have gone very different had it been earlier in the conflict. How many times do we have, maybe in 62, 63 even, where there are probes into Confederate territory, and despite the ones that are super successful, like Grierson's raid in Mississippi, they're at least able to be contained in some kind of way. Well, we no longer have that capability for the Confederates. They will not be able to capitalize on any of these victories. 1,500 to 5,000 is a huge numerical disadvantage, as we mentioned. And we also need to take into consideration what the quality of the troops looks like at this point. Remember, we have had to adjust the ages in which individuals are going to be thrown into the Confederate Army. A lot of these are going to be militia, home guard units, right? So they're not going to be the best quality of troops either. So all of those factors adding up are going to lead to the Confederacy seeing these defeats. They're going to have a bigger impact than maybe they would have been earlier in the war. Remember, too, that the First Battle of Saltville had been fought not too long ago, and there had been a larger northern host, whereas by this point, as we close out 1864, there would be far less in the command. Stoneman will continue to raid, trying to wash away the supposed failure during the Chancellorsville campaign, as well as his capture during the Atlanta campaign. We will get into his continued action in 1865. In 1864, we have another successful raid of Benjamin Grierson into Mississippi. This time, he would be in charge of 3 brigades of Federal cavalry, ready to inflict as much damage as possible. You see, in this region, we had recently seen Hood's army destroyed at Franklin and Nashville, as we have mentioned. It was a close-run thing to get the remainder of the army out of danger. Nathan Bedford Forrest and Edward Walthall having to do a lot of work with a successful rearguard action in order to make sure it was not a complete disaster. Sensing that there might be blood in the water, so to speak, Napoleon Dana was dispatching Grierson into some familiar stomping ground. Already, as we have highlighted, the supply lines were tenuous, so further destruction of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad would be a big boon to the North. Grierson's brigade commanders included the Prussian Joseph Karge, who had been wounded commanding the 2nd New Jersey in the 2nd Manassas campaign, Edward Winslow, who had participated in the Bryce's Crossroads battles, and Imberbe Osmond, whose command would also include the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry. They would see some early success cutting telegraph lines at LaGrange, a place previously mentioned in our stories, and destroying supplies stationed at Verona, Mississippi. On December 28th, we have the column converged upon from several directions by Confederate reinforcements. These rebels would be under the command of Samuel Golson. Trains were actually utilized in transporting the Confederate troops, Karge's brigade initially skirmishing with the oncoming Confederates. Additional Union troops would arrive on the field and push the Confederates into a nearby stockade. Pressure from the cavalry regiments and maybe the addition of artillery would force the rebels to surrender. Golson would be wounded during the action as more Confederates under the Port Hudson defender Franklin Gardner would arrive, but not be able to really make too much of an impact. The action at Egypt Station would see Federal casualties at a little over 100, maybe while the Confederates surrendered some 500 men. Despite Wirt Adams engaging part of the column, Grierson would make it to Vicksburg in early January. His action had seen the destruction of valuable stores, railroad track, and equipment. In fact, it had forced Hood's Army of Tennessee to retreat farther as they were unable to see supplies along the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Grierson, very familiar with Mississippi, at this point, had struck yet again. Just a quick note on Grierson before we move on. I do want to point out that he's kind of like the unsung hero of Union cavalry officers during the war. He does such a good job, actually, in not only these raids, but also in combat situations. We saw him at least be able to hold his own against Nathan Bedford Forrest, which, despite what you think about Nathan Bedford Forrest, he is a very peculiar battlefield commander. He gets the best of many in the field, so the fact that Grierson is able to hold his own there is pretty impressive. And then he's also able to launch these raids into Mississippi, where he's able to do quite a lot of damage. Even if you are a student of the Civil War, maybe you hadn't heard too much of Benjamin Grierson, so I just kind of wanted to take the time to highlight him a little bit, just kind of point this out. We always hear of the guys, Sheridan's always sort of considered to be a cavalry officer, right? Custer, that's a big one. Buford is another guy who I think needs a little bit more praise for his action at Gettysburg, right? But we could also add Grierson into those very capable Union horsemen that help to turn the product around, so to speak. Remember, they're at such a disadvantage in the beginning of the war. We have the Confederates, the Southern people, have this more of a kind of chivalric nature to them. They're more comfortable on horses than, say, the North, but they're able to actually create this product that's going to be on par with something that I think we can really say is actually superior in the early part of the war. There's not too much that the Confederates really have that we can look at and say, wow, this was really superior. Some people point at the generals and how perhaps, especially earlier in the war, they are superior than their northern counterparts. Yeah, I think it's kind of a mixed bag there. You probably have to actually, go with a case-by-case basis. But I think really across the board, you see the Confederate horsemen being a huge advantage to them, whether it's the main theater of the war, whether it's the sub-theater. And a huge part of how the Union Army is able to turn things around is the creation of a competent cavalry corps. And again, Grierson's part of that. And so as we close out the episode, we will talk about 1864 in retrospect. We started on a sour note for the Confederacy. They had recently lost Chattanooga in late 1863. Unfortunately for Pat Claiborne, there was a petition to arm the enslaved, something that will ensure he will not rise to eventual army command and probably actually seal his fate later in the year at Franklin. You probably could have argued that Claiborne could have been a decent corps commander, right? But he's not able to get there. Part of that is he makes this political faux pas in this petition, so he's never really going to get there. We saw the Red River Campaign kick off, a plan that had been hatched prior to Grant taking over as Army commander. Seems like a long time ago that we had Grant taking over, right? I feel like we've covered a lot of ground since then. And the Red River Campaign was kind of this holdover from Halleck's tenure that Nathaniel Banks is going to launch. That's really not going to have a whole lot of a point to it if you're looking at Grant's strategy. It's just going to be kind of diverting resources away from where Grant wants to go. It is possible that without the Red River Campaign, we could actually have Richmond, Atlanta, and Mobile seeing some emphasis sooner than they did during the year. Nathaniel Banks almost leads the Union into a disastrous situation that could have seen a lot of reinforcements not make it back east. Remember, we have actually 2 corps that actually end up going back to the east and serving in these battles. Even the Valley Campaign, right? We have a very large contingent there. They would not have been there, probably would have been replacement troops if anything, and that might not have stood toe-to-toe with the Confederates. In the meantime, the Overland Campaign kicks off in May with some of the heaviest casualties of the war at Wilderness and Spotsylvania. That campaign snaking down to the capital of the Confederacy, following North Anna and Cold Harbor. Now we'll talk about in a future episode just how the Overland Campaign shapes combat, shapes the war as well. But we do need to point out that the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, and I think maybe I mentioned this in the previous episodes, if you combine them into one battle, which personally I think there is an argument to be made there, it's kind of a continuous action There's not really much of a break between the two. If you combine them, there's more casualties at those two battles than there were at Gettysburg. So if you were saying, Wildravania, shall we say, the battle name there, then yeah, that's going to be the biggest battle of the war. While Grant was able to get to the gates of Richmond, there was going to be a sort of failure in terms of the overland campaign in that he was not able to get into Richmond proper. He's going to have to switch his objective to Petersburg. Now, again, we have pointed this out as well, is that McClellan kind of had this idea all the way back in 1862, although he probably was not going to be able to execute it. Probably just going to be in the idea stage, shall we say, of his campaigns. But we do have Grant shifting to Petersburg, and even though you can see just the strategic importance of Petersburg and the railroads, the limited railroads, shall we say, coming into Richmond, it's going to be seen as a failure by many in the Army, the Northern public. It's going to add to the discontent of both of those, and it's going to see a little bit of hope for the Confederacy in that, hey, we can try to finish the war here because the North is so dissatisfied, not because we are going to gain territory, not because we are going to necessarily have these sweeping battlefield victories, but we are going to hold out long enough for the war to end. Once we get to Petersburg, there's going to be a siege, and we'll see some initial assaults repulsed, of course, but it's going to then devolve into flanking movements with limited success. The crater, of course, is another huge setback. What might have been a big opportunity, turns out execution was very poor. We've said that many times in the war, how we have these situations that might have been executed to completion by a more modern military, but we're just not there in terms of military innovation during the Civil War. Now, Petersburg is going to actually see the use of United States colored regiments. It's going to be really the first time that they're going to see combat in the main theater of the war, and they're going to continue to serve through the completion. So there is that. We have seen them in the West in these smaller theaters of the war, but this is really the first time that they're going to be used in these combat scenarios. In case of, say, Newmarket Heights, which is one of these flanking movements, we have them performing very well, and we have a lot of Medal of Honors actually at Newmarket Heights that get doled out as a result. So they prove their own, that they are going to be effective combat troops, which is really what a lot of them wanted. A chance to actually show what they can do to contribute to the war effort and not serve as, Teamsters or what have you, garrison troops. In the meantime, we're actually going to see Sherman begin his campaign on Atlanta. He is going to keep outflanking Joe Johnson, with the exception of Kennesaw Mountain. Now, Kennesaw Mountain might have been a situation where Sherman's going to become impatient and really want to have the battlefield glory that Grant is seeing. It's arguable whether you can call it battlefield glory when you're just kind of racking up these casualties in these headlong assaults. But it's making headlines, right? It's making headlines in the paper. It's kind of like Rosecrans. If you can kind of compare Sherman with Rosecrans, Rosecrans has this very nice campaign at Tullahoma that does not result in a major battle, but it's going to get a lot of territory. It's going to push the Confederate Army back into Georgia. Eventually, Chattanooga is going to fall, right? The Tullahoma campaign is very critical for that. It happens at the same time as Gettysburg, so it's not going to rack up as much headlines. So we have Kennesaw Mountain as really the only blip on this campaign of maneuver. Johnson is going to be removed, and John Bell Hood is going to be placed in charge. I think you can probably tell from these episodes that I am not the biggest John Bell Hood as an army commander, so it goes without saying that he did not dazzle in this role, eventually having to abandon Atlanta. Sherman's going to continue through Georgia, reaching and capturing Savannah at the end of the year. Sterling Price is going to launch an unsuccessful foray into Missouri in the meantime. Westport, outside of Kansas City, ending this great raid. There's all kinds of emphasis on, there's two states in particular, right? There's Missouri and there's Kentucky during the war that the Confederates are going to kind of focus on as if we can sway this state, then we're going to turn the tide. And maybe that's correct because there is a lot of manpower. And certainly in the case of Kentucky, there's a lot of manpower that's left on the table. A very large percentage of the male population do not serve in the army for either side. And we have Missouri as well, where a lot of them do not serve in a conventional army, or a lot of them do not serve at all. So there's always this emphasis on, like, if we could just get that manpower, harness that manpower, well, Kentucky's going to be neutral. Missouri is it's kind of its own special case, so they're not going to be able to add those men to the ranks. But we still have the emphasis here. Sterling Price is constantly going to be trying to get back into Missouri. He finally gets his opportunity, but unfortunately the ship has sailed. Mobile Bay will fall as David Glasgow Farragut flexes the Union Navy, although he does not capture the city itself. Lincoln is going to be reelected following these successes, besting Little Mac one last time. John Bell Hood will close out the year with what will be the death of the Army of Tennessee, Franklin and Nashville, thus sealing the fate of the Second Great Army of the South. Now, we talked about it when we talked Franklin, Nashville. We talked about the March to the Sea, what had happened if Hood decides to stay within striking distance of Sherman. Maybe things would have been different. But there's really not a whole lot of thought put into this move into Tennessee. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to Bragg's operation in Kentucky in 62. He really doesn't have a plan when he goes into Kentucky. And he's very apparent by his objectives that lead to the Battle of Perryville. Hood is kind of the same way. It's like, hey, we're just going to get into Tennessee and cause some problems, and hopefully Sherman's going to follow me. Sherman doesn't. He doesn't need to, because he has George Thomas, and there's enough troops there to deal with Hood. So, with that brief rundown of all the events that we covered in 1864, where exactly are we? Well, no doubt we are toward the end of the war. The Confederacy is just not going to have the same kind of manpower that the North will be able to bring to the field. Were there opportunities for the South? I think so. Has the Union generalship, manufacturing capability, and troop experience caught up with the South, though? I think that's also a yes. So with that, let's bring this week's episode to a close. We had Stoneman's Southwest Virginia raid, the Battle of Egypt Station, and a short retrospect on the year 1864. Next week, we're actually going to rewind just a little bit. We need to go back into Alabama and talk about Lovell Rousseau and his famous raid there. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.